this. Let's speak to Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. He's a chemical weapons expert based in London. Hamish, good to speak to you this morning here on TRT World. Now, this attack on Ghouta, a grim anniversary being marked today, but of course it wasn't the last chemical weapons attack used in Syria. Why is that choice of weapon been so prevalent by the Syrian regime?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I've seen figures of over 100 uses of chemical weapons since the Ghouta attack 3 years ago. And I personally have investigated 12 myself and 2 actually inside Syria. I think the regime and Assad seem to use chemical weapons as an absolutely last-ditch effort when they're in a real difficulty. And Ghouta 3 years ago, many people believed the Syrian regime was about to fall. They used chemical weapons, and they're still in place 3 years later. When Islamic State threatened them in Dar ez-Zor, they used chemical weapons against them, and Islamic State never took that strategic airfield. And I think most recently, in the last 2 weeks, we've seen chemical attacks in both Sarakeb and Aleppo, and the Sarakeb one was in response to rebels shooting down a Russian helicopter, and of course Aleppo, as we've seen on our screens, the desperate siege there. And when the rebels broke the siege, again, Assad used chemical weapons to try and reinforce it. So a shocking anniversary.
Absolutely. And Hamish, of course, as we know, this is completely flouting international laws and the use of these kind of weapons. Red line is always talked about by Obama, people in the British administration, but yet nothing seems to be done. What can actually be done to try and stop their use of these weapons? The stockpiles were meant to have been removed, but that hasn't happened either.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And the regime did sign the Chemical Weapons Convention in October 2013. And these are crimes against humanity and crimes against the International Criminal Court. And I think, first of all, collecting evidence so that the regime at some stage will face its action. But I've been calling in the British Parliament for the last 2 weeks, and I've just returned from Iraq only yesterday. And I believe some sort of no-fly zone, a no-fly zone for helicopters in particular over civilian areas, will prevent the use of chemical weapons, because certainly from the regime's perspective, it has all been helicopters dropping barrel bombs full of chlorine or mustard gas, mustard agent. And if we prevent those helicopters flying over civilian areas, that, in my mind, will stop these bombs being used. And I think, if the Russians agree, there should be, within the UN Security Council, enough power to get this in place, because dropping chemical weapons on civilians is one of the worst crimes that we have seen this century and also last century. We've just gone after the 27th anniversary of the attack on Halabja in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein killed 5,000 people. So I think the international community must act now. And I think a no-fly zone for helicopters is a first step forward to stop these horrific weapons being used.
Well, you mentioned them there, Hamish, and I have heard your calls for the no-fly zone. It is being called for by other people, especially in Aleppo. From your conversations with the people there on the ground, the people that you deal with in terms of this, do you get any sense that we're getting closer to having an effective no-fly zone? The US were saying that the Syrian regime couldn't fly over Al-Hasaka the other day. Are we moving towards having some kind of ban on aerial aircraft flying over these sites in Syria at this moment?
Well, I very much hope so. I think a lot of people are concerned about the practicalities, but helicopters, slow-moving helicopters, are very easy to track and relatively easy, if they do transgress, to shoot down. I think the Russians are absolutely key to this. If the Russians agree to it, the Americans, particularly the potential next president, Mrs. Clinton, is in favor of no-fly zones. I think there's a growing desire in the UK to put them into place. And I think practically, they are achievable. So I very much hope so. I mean, the shocking pictures we've seen coming out of Aleppo of the boy whose picture went viral, caught in a barrel bomb attack. I'm hoping this will galvanise the world to do something, because these indiscriminate barrel bombs, be they napalm, be they chemical weapons, be they high explosive, have absolutely no part to play in a military conflict. All they're doing is killing and injuring civilians. And, I've seen figures between 300 and 400,000 civilians have been illegally killed in this conflict. And it's about time that the international community really got hold of it. The red line issue, I absolutely agree, was meaningless. And 3 years later, we've seen so many civilians dead. It's now time for the international community to get on and do something to prevent another 500,000 civilians being killed in this conflict.
OK, well, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, a chemical weapons expert from London, thank you for joining us on TRT World.